If the hour of real danger should come to England, they will be found the country's sheet anchor. So said Admiral St. Vincent of the Royal Marines, the red-coated soldiers of Britain's Royal Navy. Royal Marine history usually begins in 1664 with the raising of the Admiral's Regiment, but it's important to note that they really only became Royal Marines in 1802. Prior to that, they were simply called His Majesty's Marines, or just Marines. As one may expect, they were land soldiers raised for the purposes of serving on Navy ships. At first, the sea service regiments would have been raised and disbanded as required for individual wars, often with different structures and troop compositions, with little to no regulation actually connecting them beyond the medium of their service, of their soldiering. It was only in 1755 that His Majesty's Marines became a formal and fixed organization under Admiralty management. But regardless of their starting date, by the time the Marines became royal, they had established a long history of service, fighting in practically every naval engagement from the 7 Years' War onwards, as any warship of at least 10 guns would typically carry a detachment of them. But who were the Royal Marines really? Were they these elite commandos that we know them as today, or were they no more than standard infantrymen stationed on ships instead of on land? How were the Royal Marines recruited? How were they trained and organized? In this video, we'll explore the role and importance of His Majesty's Marines during the Napoleonic Wars, right of course after a word from our sponsor, World of Tanks.
Lieutenant, report. How fares the advance? Kapitan Obersturmpanzerkommando Gefreitenwerfer. Victoria is soon to be ours. We have advanced across open fields and deserts, we have climbed the steepest of hills and sneaked through the forest, and we have reached the enemy's urban and industrial zones. Through 40 different arenas of combat, we have utilized our historically authentic models and vehicles to destroy the foe, modifying and upgrading our equipment all along the way with the experience we have gained. With over 600 different destroyers, artillery, light, medium, and heavy tanks at our disposal, there is always a new way for us to play this game with the Allies. Wait, Lieutenant, what do you mean by all this? Playing a game with historical accuracy. We are only one brigade. We do not have 600 different vehicles at our disposal. Was? Nein, Kapitan. I do not mean the war, I mean in World of Tanks. Surely you've heard of it, the free-to-play PC game with over 100 million players worldwide. Ach, Schweinhund, nein. I do not mean the free-to-play PC game, I mean the real war. I have told you this time and time again. I do not care if you've received a free 7 days premium account and 250,000 credits simply by clicking the link in the description and using the code TANKMANIA. And don't forget about the premium tank Excelsior that we received, sir, or the 3 rental tanks we deployed to mighty effect for 10 battles each, the Tiger 131, Cromwell B, and T-3485M. Why, using enemy vehicles so readily for your entertainment and disobeying my orders? I should have you sent to the Eastern Front, Lieutenant. Now stop this dallying and give me my real report. What is the status of our real-life forces in the real-life war? Oh, jawohl. Completely halted. We ran out of fuel 3 days ago. Thank you to World of Tanks for sponsoring this video. Download the game for free today with the link below and use the code TANKMANIA for a free 7 days premium account, as well as these other fantastic benefits. Now, from the land to the sea, let's talk about the Royal Marines. At the start of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, there were only around 4,500 Marines, but by 1802, that number had expanded to 30,000, and on larger vessels, as many as 1 in every 5 men might be a Marine. So why were there so many of these men? Why were there so many Marines serving in England's wooden walls? Well, first and foremost, they were there to defend those walls, not against the French or the Spanish or whomever. They were there to defend the walls against their own defenders. The Marines were sentries, they were guards, a sort of early naval police. They were there to prevent mutiny and enforce naval regulations on the sailors, a role that was greatly expanded during the Napoleonic Wars when the risk of mutiny was so strong. The Marines would stand guard as punishments were inflicted, and they would act as sentries to important locations on the ship, like the powder magazine, very important one there, storerooms, the captain's quarters usually, and of course most dangerous of all, the spirits room. On a 74-gun ship, for example, some 30 Marines would be kept in full uniform at all times to provide a constant rotation of sentries and patrols.
The 1803 orders for the Marines of HMS Centaur stated that they always walk briskly on their posts, backwards and forwards, never to sit down, read or sing, whistle, smoke, eat or drink, but be continually alert and attentive to the execution of orders, nor ever to quit their arms on any pretense whatsoever. Whenever seamen had cause to leave their ship, for example on a shore party to maybe collect fresh water or something, you can bet that there would be a contingent of Marines there to watch over them, as much preventing their desertion as defending them from any potential enemies in the brush or some such. If the ship were in harbor, the Marines would be kept constantly under arms, ready to act at a moment's notice should any of the men attempt a mutiny or escape, probably parading on the main deck, something like that. And if the press gangs were well at work, well, what better way to guard over their stolen bodies than with a musket and a bayonet in the face? Of course, this element of the Marines' work was hardly ingratiating with the common sailor, and resentment wasn't uncommon between these two classes, if you want to phrase it that way. Marines were often deliberately kept separate from the seamen, both socially and physically, as the two of them ate and slept apart from one another. Much like between the officers and the men, strict Navy discipline demanded distance over fraternization. One officer would write of this social distance as, "No two races of men, I had well nigh said two animals, differ from one another more completely than the Jollies and the Johnnies. The influence of regular order and exact subordination is at least twice as great over the Marines as it can ever be over the sailors." This difference was resulting from the nature of Marine organization, as unlike sailors who would often have regular breaks in their service as they went from ship to ship, Marines were continuously under military discipline, whether they were aboard ship or on land. But we'll have a chance to discuss their organization more in Part 3. Just keep that in mind is all. Despite the nature of Marine service being so inherently at odds with that of regular seamen, there's little reason to believe, though, that these distinctions impeded the ability of these two to work together. Ultimately, they were all of them professional servicemen whose jobs and survival, indeed, relied on each other. It may not feel like that all the time, but, if you are a seaman, typically speaking, having the ship in working order, as things are meant to do, may not be fun, but it's often going to be the number one thing that can ensure your own survival. The sailor of our wars with France had so much esprit de corps for his own branch of the national service that he genuinely and heartily, not to say unreasonably, despised all that pertained to soldiering and pipe clay being the way that the soldiers, or the Marines in this case, would keep their belting white. But in most of the affairs we are able to relate, Marines and seamen are able to work most perfectly together. The former efficient soldiers as they were, holding the enemy's troops and covering the no less efficient cutting out and demolition work of the seamen. And that naturally brings us to the Marines' second purpose, combat with the enemy this time. During a close action, you could expect to see Marines along the taffrails of the ship, employing their musketry just as an army would ashore, firing either independently or in volleys, as well as, of course, being stationed higher up in the rigging, acting as sharpshooters, maybe aiming for officers on the enemy's deck if they can. In this way, they were very much a precision anti-personnel weapon, picking individual targets on an enemy deck, as opposed to, grape shot, which is much more, non-discriminatory, shall we say. And as iconic as that image is, it's important that we not overstate this role. For example, a 74-gun ship, we'll use that one again, might have around 120 Marines aboard, but only around a dozen of them might actually be fighting as small arms men. Simply put, when the sea is covered with dense smoke and you have these behemoth vessels firing hundreds of cannon into one another, well, even at close range, the comparative efficiency of a couple of muskets isn't usually going to be the most useful way to employ those Marines. You'll have a few of them, to be sure. Having a number of sharpshooters and everything, that is useful, but there's going to be diminishing returns, if that makes sense. Likewise, when it comes to boarding actions, the Marines weren't the elite melee force that we might have assumed them to be. When compared with more specialized weapons like boarding pikes, their muskets were clunkier, usually more difficult to handle, particularly when you're trying to move through the tight and confusing environment of an enemy man-of-war. Instead, it was actually a really common sight to see most Marines working at the ship's guns right alongside the seamen. One account from Trafalgar, for example, notes this breakdown in the traditional Navy roles. In the excitement of the action, the Marines had thrown off their red jackets and appeared in their check shirts and blue trousers. There was no distinguishing Marine from seaman. All were working like horses. Which is to say, they were working at the guns for the most part. Simply put, even though it wasn't technically their job and they were never formally trained in their use, manning the guns was just a more important task, more often than not, than anything else that the Marines could generally offer, unless the ship was actively being engaged in a boarding action, in which case maybe, yeah, having those, lines of muskets can be more useful in that sort of situation. But for the most part, the guns are really what you need the manpower for. And I think that really does speak to the role of the Marine being more about the maintaining of security aboard ship than the projection of force outside of it. This would change, however, if the ship's crew ever landed to fight on shore. In that instance, the balance would sort of shift back in favor of the Marines who were specifically trained in land warfare. While the seamen are resorting to their, pistols and swords and clubs and axes and whatnot, they're going up against a, linear professional land army. Well, the Marines are able to advance in line with far more appropriate muskets and bayonets. That's their domain, is actually fighting more on land. In a way, we'll come to that. But yes, you did hear me right. The Marines were trained not in ship-to-ship combat, they were trained in land warfare, much like the Army. So other than the fact that they were under Admiralty control, what, if anything at all, actually distinguished the Royal Marines from just being a regular old infantry and a regular old army unit that happened to be serving on a ship? Why bother having a separate corps of Marines if they're trained in so much the same way? Well, for that we come to part the second, Royal Marine recruitment, equipment, and training. Unlike sailors, Marines were landsmen, and they could not be pressed into service. They were an all-volunteer force, and their recruiting structure much resembled that of the Army. Britain was split into 5 different recruiting districts, each under the command of a field officer. Each of these districts was responsible for sending out recruiting parties, publishing materials encouraging enlistment, and providing enlistment bounties. In 1794, the bounty to enlist was 8 guineas per man, or just over £8. By 1801, it was up to £26, and by 1808, it was at £30. After their enlistment, a Marine would be paid differently depending on if he were at sea or on land. Shore pay was typically around £1 3 shillings a month, whereas at sea it would actually go down to 19 shillings 3 pence. And this is because when a man was on land, much like in the Army, he would actually have to pay for his own keep, including things like his food, whereas when the Marine is at sea, his rations are going to be provided by the king. Though they did still have to pay for their own working clothes, typically called slops, for when they weren't in their Marine uniform. They're only actually going to be dressed as Marines when they're on duty. All other times, their uniforms are going to be stowed away in a special Marines clothing room, typically on the ship's orlop deck, and the Marines are just going to walk around kind of looking like seamen. Some ships and some, situations, they would attempt to still make them look differently, dress differently, but that's not so formalized as something like the uniform itself was. As well, a Marine's pay would increase with his seniority, getting a raise of around 2 shillings every 7 years. So with all of that, you can see just how high an enlistment bounty of £30 really was. Well, why so much? Well, much like the rest of the military during this period of unrivaled eternal warfare, the Royal Marines were kind of desperate for recruits a lot of times. So much so that on a number of occasions, even, regular land soldiers had to serve as Marines, much as they had in previous years. Alongside raising the bounty, the Marines significantly reduced a lot of their standards for enlistment. For example, height requirements went as low as 5 feet and 2 inches. In 1804, even boys, which is to say, minors, like children by today's standards, were permitted to enlist as Marines to be paid as men when they turned 15 years old. Although these younger people were typically just kept in barracks as a reserve force, so that they can go to actually serve and they know what they're doing when they turn 15, and much like the Army did during wartime, the terms of enlistment would also decrease. Typically, a Marine is going to be enlisting for 20 plus years. It's called long service, or lifetime service, basically. But during wartime, many men were permitted to enlist for a period of around 5 to 7 years. Sometimes you'd enlist for the duration of the war itself, things like that. Colonies and prisoner of war camps also became ripe recruiting grounds for the Marines, as in the former case, recruiting stations were opened in Malta and the West Indies, while in the latter, military prisoners who had been forced into French service before being captured by the British became targeted for enlistment as a means of escape from the prison. For example, a lot of Dutch soldiers volunteered with the Marines in order to get out of the prison, which they didn't really have much of a place being in the first place, because it's not like they were willingly fighting for the French. The French conquered them, so you know how all that goes. Although these practices of recruiting foreigners ended in 1810, when the numbers began to stabilize a bit for the Marines, and it was found out that the number of foreign Royal Marines had become a little bit too high for the Admiralty's tastes. In any case, once the men were actually recruited, what did their training look like? Well, again, it's actually really similar to the situation in the Army. There was no fixed training period for a Marine before they were liable for deployment to a ship, and they would be sent out based on their individual readiness and the needs of the service as determined by their divisions. More on that later. Their training consisted of drill, a lot of it, and it was 100% infantry drill, the same basic stuff, the same movements that the Army was doing, except with less large-scale, like battalion-sized maneuvering, and more of an emphasis on the individual elements of things like the firings for, well, obvious reasons. You're not dealing with very large numbers of men on board a ship. They still do a little bit of the larger maneuvering, just not as much as the regular Army. And as for the firings, they would be given both blank and live ammunition for practice, for marksmanship practice, again, much the same as the Army was. But when it came to any sort of knowledge of ships, of sea life, well, that was all acquired on the job. Thomas Rees, for example, a Marine recruit sent to a ship after a year of training on land, would write that he was, quote, "so ignorant of everything belonging to a ship that when I first went on board, I scarcely knew the head from the stern." Now, that's probably a bit of an exaggeration, but you get the idea. At the end of the day, there was actually a lot less to distinguish the Royal Marines from the regular Army than one might assume. They're obviously, carrying out different styles of duty, one's on land, one's at sea, but at their core, they were actually very similar in their training and their recruitment and all that kind of stuff. But despite those similarities, it's important to remember that the Royal Marines were not a part of the Army. They had their own organization, and they were managed by the Admiralty, not by horse cards. They were not Army soldiers sent to fight at sea. They were the Navy's land arm. And that brings us to our final segment, Royal Marine Organization and Deployment. If you've seen my previous videos about British Army organization, then this section may feel a little surreal, because while the Royal Marines are sharing a lot of the same terms and even philosophies of Army organization, these things are being handled in a very different way. The Royal Marines, at least during this time period, did not have regiments. Instead, the Marines were divided into 4 divisions, one each based in Chatham, Portsmouth, Plymouth, and Woolwich. Each division, in turn, was made up of companies, sort of like regiments in the Army, but on a much larger scale and much more centralized. In 1813, they respectively numbered 48, 49, 49, and 41 companies each, as opposed to a regiment, which is only going to have 10. The nominal size of each company as well was much larger. In 1810, it was around 178 officers and men, although naturally the majority of those Marines would have been serving on ships out at sea, and if you were to actually visit these divisions, you'd find companies of roughly 15 men apiece and a select few officers. And this is because whenever a ship required Marines, they wouldn't just pull an entire company out of the division and then put it on the ship to serve. Rather, much like in the Army, each of the companies were organizational formations, not combat ones. Each one of them would furnish a selected number of men for the detachment, and then when all the Marines from these different companies were brought together under their new ship, they became a sort of temporary new unit with a new command structure and whatnot, being that ship's Marines. Much of like how in the Army, soldiers would be detached from their companies to form sub and grand divisions for combat, which again, that makes a lot more sense if you've seen my other videos there. Now, these Marines are retaining their old divisional and company designations because that's where they would return when their ship service was finished. And meanwhile, back at home, the companies would continue to be bringing in new recruits, furnishing them with equipment, and training them for service when their number came up. These divisions would also post garrisons in the ports where they were based, guarding things like naval warehouses, shipyards, and offices. And in this way, even during peacetime, the Marines were constantly under military discipline, unlike their seamen counterparts. And when at sea, their command structure would vary depending on the size of the ship that they were on. For example, for a ship of 50 guns or more, the contingent was usually commanded by a Royal Marine captain, and on a smaller ship, it was commanded by a lieutenant, although the smallest of commands with just a handful of Marines could even be led by a sergeant with no officer present at all, again, depending on the needs of the service at the time. Larger ships would typically have roughly 1 NCO for every 20 men, and a smaller ship, 1 for every 10. So, the majority of the Navy is going to be something around in those margins. Just like the Army, these sergeants and corporals, they're going to handle the day-to-day drilling and discipline of the men, the assigning of work detail, as well as various other administrative duties. And much like how Marines were deployed to ships, they could also be deployed to land, en masse as regular infantry units, again with each company sending men to form a larger Marine battalion. Throughout the Napoleonic Wars, 3 battalions of Marines would see extended service in Portugal and Spain, as well as in North America. But while they may have been working alongside the Army, they were always under Navy discipline and maintained their own separate command structures as a result, something which often led to disputes between officers on land operations. So in conclusion, who were the Royal Marines? Were they this elite unit of spec-up commandos? Well, no, not really. Nor were they just another infantry force, just like the Army, that all happened to be stationed at sea. The Royal Marines of Nelson's Navy may not have served in quite the role that we'd first envisioned for them, but they were a vital element of Britain's defense during the Napoleonic era. They were a fighting police force of a sort, and they were a miniature army to be deployed by the Admiralty of their own volition, from ship, a projectile to be fired by the Royal Navy, to use a later on quote. And without these men, to be sure, the wooden walls of Britain would surely have rotted away and collapsed to mutiny and all sorts of other nefarious nonsense. Until the next time, my dear viewer, I am and I shall remain your most humble and obedient of servants. Now, very nearly all of the information in this video came from this book, Nelson's Navy, The Ships, Men, and Organization by Brian Lavery. Lavery? Whatever it is, you see the name there. If you'd like to learn more about the Royal Marines or anything to do with the Navy of this time period, including of other nations, it has a lot of more generic information. It even has a section on the French Navy, the Spanish Navy, the American Navy, things like that. Well, this really is the book for you. It's really good, a lot of solid information. I will link it in the description for you. And one last thing there, well, hold on now. What about the uniforms? Oh, look at this weird top hat thing. How could I not talk about the uniforms, about the weapons and whatnot? Were they the same as the Army? Did the Marines get their own specialized kit? Oh, well, dear viewer, there is so much more that I could talk about the Royal Marines, but I've used up so much of your time already, and I just couldn't make it all fit into this video. But despair not, for there is an addendum video in addition to this one that is now live only on Recast.tv. Recast is a subscription-free streaming platform, much like YouTube, except it is much better for creators like myself for reasons that I'll detail in a comment down below. So if you enjoyed this video and you'd like to learn more about the Royal Marines and their uniforms and weapons and whatnot, well then swing on down to Recast and you can see part 2 of who were the Royal Marines of Nelson's Navy, where we'll discuss all that stuff. Thank you very much. I will see you there.